All right, welcome back. This is going to be Unit 7, World War II, Lesson 4. We're talking about the actual war itself, everybody's favorite lesson. So let's get into it. Remember to take out your journals, please, guys, and write your heading. Also, don't forget to write the essential question. How did the Allies, that is America, we're in it to win it now, right, after Pearl Harbor, Britain, the UK, jolly old England, with Winston Churchill, Mr. Never Give Up, Never Surrender. And finally, the last of the Allied powers in World War II is going to be our good old scary buddy, Joseph Stalin, with the big mustache. Remember, he is communist and he is the dictator of the Soviet Union. And they are our allies in World War II, even if we don't trust them. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So we're going to be looking at how the Allies are going to win World War II in both of the theaters of war. When we talk about theaters of war, we mean where the fighting is happening. And in World War II, fighting is all over the place. It's a massive world war. It's the biggest war in human history. Fighting will be taking place in the Pacific against the Japanese, and it's going to be taking place in Europe and in North Africa against the Nazis, and I guess also against Italy. Remember Mussolini, rhymes with linguini. And keep in mind that when we're fighting against the Japanese, this is going to be with our policy of island hopping. This is our strategy because the Pacific Ocean is rather big, and this will be involving a lot of naval combat where we're going to be sending our ships to various islands as we try to get closer and closer to the Japanese mainland, at least close enough to be able to bomb them, which is what we will eventually do. Now we're going to start off our story. Here we go. By talking about what is happening and what everybody wants to accomplish out of this war. And remember, it is Pearl Harbor that got America pulled into this conflict. Economically, we had already kind of chosen a side. Remember, when we started to do Lend-Lease in 1941, we had already basically declared that we were on the side of the British and kind of the Soviets. Basically, we declared that we were against the Nazis and against the Japanese. And then in Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese surprise attacked us. They sucker punched us there in Hawaii. They took out most of our Pacific fleet of ships, and then they went and they took our colony, the Philippines. No, they did not. So we declared war the very next day. President Franklin Roosevelt, he said, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. That means it's going to be famous forever for a bad reason, because over 2,500 American sailors died. They were murdered by the Japanese when we had been neutral and actually in peace negotiations with the Japanese. And so if you go to Pearl Harbor today, there is a big memorial to the ships that were sunk, especially the big battleships where most of the sailors died. And the most infamous of these was the battleship Arizona. And remember, the Arizona, its hull was completely shredded in two, and that bomb went right down into the magazine. A big explosion in both sides, the stern and the bow, they sunk really fast, trapping many of the sailors on board that ship, unable to escape, and they drowned to death. And the ship became kind of their permanent mausoleum where their bodies decayed underwater. From 1941 until today. And so there's a memorial you can see right here that's built above the ruins of the battleship Arizona there in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. That's on Oahu, same island where you have Honolulu, same island where Barack Obama was born in 1963, I believe. But you could just see the outline under the water of the battleship Arizona. There's one of its steam stacks. And this is where visitors can take a little boat to this memorial and look down. And if you are a survivor of the battleship Arizona, one of those sailors that had managed to escape before the ship went down, and you die, you have the option to actually have your ashes spread by divers inside the ship so you can be buried alongside your brothers at arms. And remember that the explosions also were really big and very bad at Pearl Harbor because many of these ships had just taken on oil like the day before. And so there is still, you can see right here, there is still like a little bit of oil slowly leaking out of the ship. And many of the visitors that go there, ironically, many of the visitors that go to see the Pearl Harbor Memorial and honor the fallen American sailors, many of those visitors that go to Hawaii are Japanese who, perpetuated the attack, but many of the visitors, they say that the oil slowly, constantly leaking out of the ship Since 1941 to today, it's almost like the ship is bleeding. Remember, that is a permanent resting place for all of those dead. And so we're going to be fighting the Japanese in the Pacific, and I'll talk about that later. But first off, we're going to start with Europe. And I do want to start off with what each side is wanting and what each country wants out of this conflict. So for Nazi Germany, these are the Axis powers, the three bad guys, the three main bad guys. You got the Empire of Japan with Hirohito, their emperor, their godlike king, and then the guy running the show, actually calling the shots, the mortal, is Hideki Tojo, okay? Now for Italy, remember we have Mussolini, and he is fascist. He was like the inspiration for Hitler. And of course, Adolf Hitler is the dictator, the Führer of Nazi Germany. And there is the swastika on the German flag. All right, so these are the Axis powers, the bad guys. What does Germany want? They want to take over Europe and eliminate the so-called inferior peoples, such as the Jews, Slavic people, Eastern Europeans, Gypsies, people with disabilities, homosexuals, anybody that did not fit into Hitler's Aryan race. And remember, he talked about his views in Mein Kampf, My Struggle, his book that he wrote while he was in prison. And in it, he also mentioned in his dastardly plots and plans that he wanted to create some Lebensraum, some living space for his master race, okay, for his Aryan race. And that meant wiping out all of Eastern Europe and all of those Jewish, inferior Slavic people, according to the Nazis, to make room for this master race. Italy, they want to recreate the Roman Empire of old, basically get back some power, get back some respect, okay? Nobody's been respecting Italy for a while. They want to get back that former glory, a new Mediterranean empire like the Romans of old. That is what Mussolini would like, and he will begin in the 1930s by actually invading places in Africa. So this does bring the war into Northern Africa. And then the Empire of Japan, remember Japan is a series of islands. They're very limited in resources, but they have industrialized. They need access to oil, steel, rubber, all of those resources. So they need to expand. And they are going to be doing that by carving out a Pacific empire, by taking over places in Eastern Asia. They began doing this in 1931 by invading China. And in 1937, they invaded Manchuria, which is northern China, committing brutal atrocities against the Chinese people, who were mostly a peasant class at this point. It was very unfair. It was very barbaric. There's a reason they call it the Rape of Nanking. And they will continue. They take over the Korean Peninsula, and after Pearl Harbor, they are free with no American fleet to stop them, right? They are free to take over the Philippines and to continue to carve out their empire going into Southeastern Asia, taking over colonies of the French in Indochina, like where Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia are today, even taking over parts of the British colonies in Southeast Asia, like Burma, which is Myanmar today, and going as far as Indonesia, and trying to get even to Australia. So that's the Japanese. So those are the goals of the Axis powers. Basically, if you summarize all of them, they want to take over people and take over resources and take over land, and anybody who gets in their way is going to die. That's pretty bad. Now, if you look at the goals of the Allied powers, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, ultimately what all three of us allied, the friends, we want to do is we want to stop those bad guys. And we want to basically make sure that they don't take over the world. Like World War II is pretty simple. Remember World War I, we had like the main causes, the militarism, the alliances, the imperialism, the nationalism, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand was the spark that launched this war that didn't have to happen in the first place. But because of all these factors leading up for decades, the war was almost inevitable, but it didn't have to happen. It was mainly waged by all of these cousin kings and queens, and it was a mess, right? World War I was a tragic war that happened for many complicated reasons, but ultimately it didn't have to happen. It wasn't, there's no clear like good versus evil. I guess the Germans, plundering Belgium was pretty bad, but it's not like World War II. World War II is really simple. There's bad, evil dictators trying to take over the world, and we needed to stop them before they could do that. So there you go. All right, here's what the situation looks like in Europe. Did the Nazis succeed in conquering the Soviet Union? If you look, Operation Barbarossa, this is when Hitler and Stalin, two mass murdering sociopaths, two really nasty dictators, they had a non-aggression pact, right? Where both of them, they shook hands and they said, we agree not to attack each other. Hitler and Stalin. I bet both of them had like, you know, fingers behind their back saying, psych, okay? And it was just a matter of time, like who was gonna betray who? Was Hitler gonna betray Stalin first, or was Stalin gonna betray Hitler first? Well, Hitler ended up betraying Stalin first. And in 1941, in June, he launched Operation Barbarossa, one of the biggest invasions in all of human history, where you had over 2 million Nazis over this thousands and thousands of miles of front basically invade the Soviet Union. Remember, this is what Russia has become. It's communist. This is Russia, Soviet Union, USSR. And there is Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union, where, you know, Stalin's headquarters is and everything. There's Berlin, that's the capital of Germany. That's where Hitler's at and stuff. And so the Nazi army, the Weimar, no, hold on, where'd they go? Yeah, the Nazi army, they're going to be marching into the Soviet Union. And as they go through Eastern Europe, that's where they're going to be committing a lot of the horrendous acts of violence that are part of the Holocaust, and taking a lot of the peoples in Eastern Europe that will be the ones that will suffer the brunt of the death camps and the concentration camps, the gas chambers and all of that in the final solution after 1942. Basically, Hitler, again, he's following through on his plan. This is his wanting Lebensraum, take over Eastern Europe and kill all these people and make room for his master race. Now, the Soviet Red Army will fight back, and they have a big ally in the form of Mother Nature. This is something that the great French emperor and battlefield commander Napoleon Bonaparte learned as well, that it is very dangerous to invade Russia because you can get caught there very easily in the Russian winter, and even worse, the Russian spring. So even if you come prepared with like all sorts of winter gear, keep in mind that in the spring, when all that snow and ice melts, the roads are going to be a muddy mess. If you have horses or cars or whatever tramping, you know, day after day, hour after hour on that ground, it's going to be such a slop. It's going to be almost impossible to move anything on those roads if they're not paved, which a lot of roads at this time were not paved. And so that is going to be a huge mistake on Hitler's part and his army. The Nazis will get stuck there in the Soviet Union. You can see they almost make it to Moscow. In fact, they get to the edges of the city, but they're going to be repulsed. Another big battle is going to happen here on the Eastern Front against the Germans versus the Soviets. That's called the Battle of Stalingrad. Over 1 million people die there. It's one of the bloodiest battles in human history. There's sniper attacks and everything else, but eventually the Soviets will be able to push the Germans back out. So no, Hitler made a big mistake, and he's going to pay for it. He's going to get stuck fighting those Russians for the rest of the war. And that will ultimately help to lead to the Nazis' defeat. The second question here, what's the only allied nation in Western Europe by 1941? So if we look at the continents of Europe, this is all in Eastern Europe, you know where Russia is, that's Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria. I've been there. Actually, I did a horse trip. We rode horses like this whole loop right there, right where like the U and the L are. That's all Eastern Europe. And then if you look at Western Europe, okay, this is like Germany, Switzerland, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, and there's the United Kingdom. That's Great Britain, England. Okay, it's all the same place. It's right there. It looks like if you look on the key, the Allied powers are in orange. The only country that is still free of the Nazis is the United Kingdom. So that would be the answer to that. So these are the only two that are left fighting the Nazis by the end of 1941. It's going to be the Soviet Union and the United Kingdom, or Great Britain. Okay. Now, the war in the Atlantic is going to look very similar to how it did in World War I. You're going to have a lot of German U-boats, even bigger and badder, German submarines this time, that are going to be wreaking havoc on America's merchant fleet. So U-boats are still a major problem for our shipping. Okay, and you're going to have the Atlantic Wall, a defense that is put up in the United States, I'll talk about later, that basically created an inland passage to protect our ships, which you could see on like the Texas coast. And there were German U-boats that got like up to the Gulf Coast, that got up to Texas and were sunk. So they were prowling all throughout the waters of the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean, trying to hunt down American ships that were sending desperately needed supplies like Lend-Lease to the British and to the Soviet Union. Remember, if it were not for our Lend-Lease, us giving supplies with no hope of getting money back immediately, we were just given the supplies, the food, the medicine, the military supplies like the ships, the tanks, all the stuff. We were just giving it over to the British and the Soviets so that they could continue to survive and fight, because at this point they were all that was standing between the Nazis and total domination. Okay, moving on. So the Soviets and Nazis battle for Stalingrad. Yes, Stalingrad was a nasty, nasty piece of work right there. There's a big Soviet monument to its day. There's a big sniper battle that takes place. It's been documented in a famous movie, Enemy at the Gates. And basically the Soviet Union is able, with the help of Mother Nature, and I guess you could say Father Winter, to kick out the Nazis. They get stuck in the famous Russian winter, and many of them are going to freeze to death. Those that don't freeze to death are going to get stuck and unable to move, especially when the springtime rains and snow melts and everything else. So it's going to be a mess for the Germans. Now you have also the beginning of America in this fight, and that is going to be with the United States finally entering the war against the Nazis, because we had decided, along with the British and the Soviets, that we were going to focus more of our attention first on Europe, and then we would turn our focus over to the Pacific to fight the Japanese. Because remember, we got enemies in both places, okay? So we decided the first place that America is going to go to isn't going to be in Europe at all. It's actually going to be in North Africa. Europe's a continent, Africa's another continent. If you didn't know, there's 7 continents. You should be familiar with them. Some of you are like, man, world geography. Ugh, yeah, that's right. You should have remembered. Okay. So we're gonna invade North Africa first, and you might be left thinking, why did we do that? The Nazis are mostly in Europe. They're kicking Russia's butt right now. They're closing in on Britain. If the Battle of Britain, England is hanging on by a thread. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing fronts. We shall never give up. We shall never surrender. They're just clinging. They're just barely hanging on. Their darkest hour. Shouldn't America be going like right here and helping to defend our best buddy, our good friend, our mommy country, England? You have a good thought there, but keep in mind that America hasn't been at war for a while, and we're a little rusty, and we're a little scared that if we just join right in the thick of things, we're going to get overwhelmed and lose a whole lot more young American men than we need to. We need to get some experience points. If this was a video game like Call of Duty, which there are a lot of World War II Call of Duty games out there. My favorite is actually, I like Battlefield better, but that's personal preferences. Don't judge me too hard. And so we are going to go to North Africa first, where there were Nazis and there were Italian soldiers, and they were mainly there because North Africa holds the lines of supply, especially for oil. Oil's in the Middle East, in Egypt, okay? If you can control North Africa, you also have an easy access point to Italy. So it's about gaining control of supply lines for oil. It's about also getting access to Italy, which Winston Churchill called the soft underbelly of Europe. He's basically dissing the Italians again. They get no respect and saying that Mussolini's a punk, and that would be way easier for us to get into Europe than trying to go right here into France, where like the Nazis have all these defensive walls and they're like their best military's right there. It's like, that's gonna be really hard to get through. Let's try going where they're weak, Italy. And to take Italy, you gotta take North Africa. So that's why we're gonna go to North Africa first. This is Operation Torch. American soldiers are gonna land in Morocco, and then we're gonna make our way going east, okay? And then we're gonna have the battles of El Alamein and these others in Egypt. And this is where you get the famous like battle of these very famous generals doing like tank warfare in the Sahara Desert, which is pretty epic. And so you need to kind of maybe be familiar with these leaders, these military generals. The main guy for the United States is George Patton. Now, Mr. Patton, 3-star general there, he is probably the most famous World War II general besides Eisenhower. And Patton's going to get in trouble later for basically slapping a soldier who had PTSD. Patton doesn't put up with anything, okay? He's a mean, scary dude, but luckily he was on our side. He liked to curse a lot, and he really liked to get things done. And remember that he had been involved with tanks and with early tank warfare since the beginning of like mechanized warfare. He had been actually part of that raid that Pershing did against Pancho Villa into Mexico in 1915. And so Patton is going to be our main general fighting the Nazis in North Africa. Now, he had a big rivalry with his ally, the British general, one of the great British generals in World War II, Bernard Montgomery. Isn't that quite a British name? Bernard Montgomery. So there's Montgomery. And then the main German general here is very famous. His name is Erwin Rommel. And he had a nickname. He was called the Desert Fox. And that's because of his brilliant maneuvering and stuff during these battles. But Erwin Rommel was a German general, not necessarily a Nazi general. And I make that distinction because there will be many assassination plots to try to eliminate Hitler by some of his own people, especially some of his military people like Rommel, who believed that Hitler was ruining Germany and leading to Germany's destruction, which ultimately he did. And so one of those assassination plots, Project Valkyrie, there's a movie about it, they actually recruited Rommel to agree to take over if they succeeded in killing Der Fuhrer. If they succeeded in assassinating Hitler, Rommel was supposed to take over Germany and agree to a surrender to the Allies to save Germany from itself. And Hitler didn't die in the explosion that was planned. He survived, and he hunted down all the conspirators. And when he found out that Rommel was involved, he gave Rommel a choice. And this is after Rommel was already called back from North Africa. They'd lost North Africa. Rommel was building the defense, the Atlantic seawall defense against the planned invasion of northern France. So that was all of Rommel's entrenchment and his work. But Rommel was called back in Germany and given the choice in the middle of the night, these SS guards, these high Nazi, scary Gestapo police guards, they show up and they tell Rommel, hey, we know you were part of the conspiracy to assassinate Hitler. Okay, you have two choices. You can, one, take a ride with us and we'll make it look like an accident. We'll drive your car off a cliff and nobody will be none the wiser. You can basically choose to commit suicide, they're saying, and your family will be taken care of. They'll be given a pension and nothing will happen to them. The second option was to go through a lengthy court-martial and be charged as a traitor, and his family's lives would be forfeit. So of course, the great Desert Fox, he chooses to commit suicide. But that was Erwin Rommel. He was the German general. And that is what is going on in Europe. Now there's going to be a lot of other stuff here we're going to talk about later. That's all I want to talk about right now. The Casablanca Conference. Casablanca is this beautiful white stone city in Morocco, capital of Morocco. And in January of 1943, you're going to have the Allied leaders. And you can see them sitting there. Sitting why? Because FDR can't stand. Remember, he has polio. So there is Franklin Roosevelt, our president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. Here you have Winston Churchill. He's the British leader, okay? And right here is Mr. Charles de Gaulle. Charles de Gaulle was the leader of many of the French freedom fighters, because remember, at this point in time, France was occupied by the Nazis. They had been quickly overrun and defeated in 1940. And but there were still many French people that were resisting the Nazi rule, and one of their leaders was de Gaulle. The other guys here, right here, and you can see they didn't want to sit next to each other because they were both kind of competing over who's going to be in charge of the Free French. Absent from this picture, you might remember there is another key leader of the Allied forces, and that is our not so good buddy, Mr. Joseph Stalin, the communist leader of the Soviet Union. The reason he was not in attendance is because he was busy in the fight of his life over here, right? You can see he is totally surrounded by the Nazis. He's in bad shape. And so he was not able to get over to Casablanca. Now, in this conference where the Allied leaders are meeting, they decide to increase the bombings of Germany, and that with control of North Africa, it would be much smarter for them to invade Italy first. Okay, again, Churchill says, let's go after the soft underbelly. They also decide that the Allies would only accept unconditional surrender. That means Italy, Japan, and Germany would have to agree to unconditional surrender before we would stop fighting them. An unconditional surrender is where you surrender without any buts, no conditions, okay? No excuses. Like, hey, I agree to surrender and do whatever you tell me. It's not, hey, I'll surrender, but I get to keep Poland. Or, hey, I'll surrender, but I get to keep Ethiopia. Or, hey, I'll surrender and get to keep this or that. That's conditions, right? So unconditional surrender only. And that's going to be really important for ending the war. All right. And another thing I should mention, just keep in mind that because they agree to go after Italy first, that's going to delay any relief that the Soviets are going to get. Stalin was really pushing for the Allies, for Britain and the United States, to launch a massive invasion across the English Channel right here on the map into France, to get right into the heart of the really bad German defenses here. Because then Hitler would be forced to send more of his reinforcements and more of his soldiers that were like all up here. He'd have to send them over here. And that would relieve some of the pressure that Stalin was under. Now, when FDR and Churchill decide not to do that, but instead to go into Italy first, Stalin is very upset. You know, he kind of feels like, and maybe it was true, maybe it wasn't, but he kind of feels like Germany and the Soviet Union, you know, they're fighting and killing each other, and that Churchill and FDR are okay with that. Which, I mean, if you ask Churchill, he probably was okay with that. But again, that's not confirmed or anything. But the longer that we delayed opening up a second front, a Western front in Europe, it is true, the more time that the Soviets and the Nazis had to wipe each other out over here on the Eastern Front. So that was the Casablanca Conference. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about today is how Italy is finally going to be defeated. And there are some very troubling photos here, so viewer discretion is advised, okay? Just have to say that. But basically, Italy is going to be invaded in Operation Husky and Avalanche. We go into Sicily, and then we go into Italy proper. This is where you're going to have the Tuskegee Airmen flying missions against the Nazis. There are actually more Nazis, German soldiers in Italy than there were Italian soldiers. Again, the Italian army doesn't do so hot in World War I or in World War II. And we're storming castles, we're taking back Italian, wine country and Italian cities and all these places. And the Italian people are suffering, and they're getting increasingly frustrated with their dictator, Benito Mussolini. And finally, in late 1943, Mussolini is going to try to flee the country before he can be apprehended by his own people. Italy surrendered in 1943, and Mussolini tried to hide out and escape, and he makes it until 1945, until just a month or two before Europe is totally won by the Allies. And as he's trying to escape, he gets captured, and in Milan city square, he and his mistress and two of his most important aides, they are strung up by the people of Milan, this big city in northern Italy. And they are basically shot, and then their bodies are strung up, and the people throw rotten fruit and insults, and they basically mutilate the corpses to show their displeasure with Mussolini. Hitler will find out about how Mussolini's body was treated, and this will be one of the big reasons why Hitler decides to do what he does. Is Hitler is not only going to commit suicide before the Allies can reach Berlin. Hitler will also make sure that his assistants burn his body and that of his recently married wife, even their dog, make sure that their corpses are burned so that people couldn't capture his body and do to it what was done to Mussolini. All right, so that was in 1943. Italy surrenders. Mussolini is killed in 1945 by his own people. The Italians are not happy with being dragged into this war and how it ended up. And here is one of the most famous American bombers, the B-24 Liberator. You can see all the bombs that it's carrying. It's a war machine. Why did Roosevelt and Churchill decide to attack Italy first? Churchill called it the soft underbelly. Between Italy and Germany, who was weaker? Italy was, Mussolini was. So this was a way for us to get into Europe without having to face overwhelming casualties. When we do decide to open a second front into Europe, a Western front over here in France, the casualty rate is going to be high. It's going to be a massive invasion that's going to take a lot of resources and a lot of men, and that's going to be called D-Day. And that's what we'll talk about next time. Thank you guys so much, and I will talk to you later.